Fab. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Just a couple of quick introductions. So today we are the Launch Collective, which is a community of go-to-market recruiters in the SaaS space all across North America and Europe from different sizes, shapes, and sectors of business. Ultimately, we created this community as a real value add to the space. I think naturally, as we've spoken to lots of people within TA and HR and recruitment, everyone always said there was never really a central source of truth for everything and a community where best practices and information can be shared. Um, so this is sponsored by Strive. So just very quickly, I think most of us know Strive, but we are a boutique go-to-market recruitment agency. We typically help earlier stage VC-backed venture capital businesses scale their go-to-market teams. We're 8 years old now, over 1,000 placements made, and we're really happy to be sponsoring this today. Mariam, I'll kind of pass over to you for your introduction as our guest host today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, John. So my name's Mariam. I'm one of the partners at Iconic. We are one of the tier one investment firms, both a growth and venture fund as well as a family office, originally founded by Zuckerberg. And I lead one of our global teams supporting our founders.
Amazing. Well, it's great to have you on here today. Look, let's do a couple of quick fire questions to get to know you a little bit better. Um, so something I always ask when I interview candidates for the very first time is, like if all jobs were paid equal, what would you do?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I said if all jobs were paid equal in life, what job
Okay.
would you have picked to do?
I love animals, so I would always want to be a vet.
Nice. I like it. Okay, fantastic. And what's kind of like a quote you live by or a mantra?
Probably only worry about the things that you can control.
Nice. I really, really like it. And I guess, our sector's quite hectic at times. What's the best way you like to chill out and switch off?
I'm a homebody, so just being at home, it's a peaceful vibe at home.
Nice. I feel you there. Or I did feel
Yeah.
you until we had a baby, and now home's a little bit hectic for us, but it's all good fun. Well, look, let's kick off onto things then. I think most of us are here now. So first of all, a big thank you to yourself for sharing Iconic's recent report with the community. We're really looking forward to drilling into some of the content on today's forum. I think what would be quite useful, first of all, is to understand a bit more about the report. So,
Yeah.
how it was compiled, who contributed, and why did you guys choose to produce it?
Yeah, for sure. All really great questions. So I guess maybe just taking a step back for a second, a big part of Iconic's proposition is really about how do we take sort of the collective experiences that we learn as, investors, as operators, as, access to some of the greatest founders in the world, and how do we create that to be practical insight for our future founders, and our future leaders in our companies. And so that is kind of the spirit behind everything that we do, particularly our content and our analytics, is really about how do we take sort of what we've learned from the past and either, help educate or help founders predict what could come in the future and help them get ahead of it. The best sort of truths can sometimes be the past, right? And I think in the world of AI, that's somewhat caveated, but I think fundamentally for us, we create all of our sort of analytics reports to really help our founders kind of see around the corner. And so we were really excited to create our 2026 report, really as just like a pulse check around how has the world and the AI ecosystem changed and what has that meant to all of our companies, particularly the ones that are traditional software that are trying to reinvent themselves. And as talent leaders, right, with that lens, what does that mean in terms of like building great teams and hiring and scaling out great organizations? And fundamentally, that does look very different than the world of traditional software. And so, what we did to sort of create this data, all proprietary, we sent out a survey Q4 last year. We interviewed and got respondents from 300 or so executives across varying stages of companies, from CEOs to engineering leaders to CROs, CFOs, both from the US and Europe. And so there's a real spread across those 300. And we basically just try to sort of create these really commonalities and the themes across all of those answers. And then what was really nice and unique, actually, for the first time, we were able to sort of cross-reference that data longitudinally to the results last year, right, when we made our first report. And so what's interesting about the one now is that we can see some of the major changes that have happened over the last 12 months and kind of we're in a different phase of, I would say, within AI at the moment. And so that's kind of all the work that was put into it. And then we layered some of the data with some qualitative storytelling and interviews and quotes from some people in our network.
Amazing. Well, look, I think the report is going to be of interest to most people. I hear the word AI every single day of my life now, including the weekend. So everyone, I'm sure, will be interested to know more. So let's focus in on three key areas from the report in today's forum. So, first area I'd like to touch on is how AI is breaking traditional performance methods. So, can you explain a little bit more about what the report is by this and what you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. So we would see that, last year, lots of companies were kind of experimenting with AI, and you would see that in terms of how they would use it, right? Internally, you would see it in terms of how it showed up in their product and to customers. And you would also see it just in terms of how they thought about like headcount planning and roadmap and allowing budget, right, for these AI tools. And so it was very sort of exploratory, experimenting, team by team, was not consistent throughout lots of organizations. And I think one of the main things that we found in this report now is that we are definitely in kind of this execution era, right, where it is less clumpy, right? And it's more consistent. And you're seeing a lot more resource and intentionality going behind it in terms of how we show up for customers from an AI perspective. And then how do we actually run the organization and build the organization internally using AI and automating what we can. And so that fundamentally changes everything as we think about like our performance structure, right? And what is good performance? Because I think so much of sort of the historical structure, whether it be formal or informal, was around the inputs, right? More hours means better output, right? A lot of the time, or more resource, better output. You think about the traditional law firm ecosystem around billable hours, right? Like everything was very much associated with like what's important and what is meaningful is attached to number of hours, right? And effort. And I think we're now in this place where performance can't really be attached to that as like a proxy anymore, right? Because ultimately we are trying to drive efficiency. And so actually you start to see a bigger sort of discrepancy between your high performers and your lower performers, right? And so actually your higher performers in theory start to use less time doing jobs, right? But doing more impactful, more strategic, more complex workflows. And then, the ones that are maybe lower performing are doing more of those input, that the hours, the longer hours, right? But actually the outputs are not necessarily there. And so, when you look at, for example, there was a stat in the report that, R&D teams naturally are the ones that are in organizations, using AI the most, and they're seeing, 30 to 40% time saving, right? But they're more efficient, right? And so they're using it for efficiency. And I think that's the thing that's really important across all of our teams. And as talent leaders thinking about that, right? Because now it's no longer about size of team and headcount management and how you're scaling out from a time perspective, but actually it's more about like the efficiency. And so I think one of the big things is like, how do you manage sort of your high performers at the very top and then your lower performers? Because I think what AI does is removes the middle bit more. I think in the world that we historically have been in, you would have the outliers were high performers and the lower performers were outliers, and most people kind of sat in the middle. I think you start to see that look very different. And so the performance of and the management of those two groups needs to change slightly. Um, and then I would also just say like, you know, compensation and like the ability to misprice talent is a really big topic, right? Because normally compensation was kind of linked to the criticality of the role and the seniority of the role and the impact of the role. And sometimes it was linked to, the hours you worked, right? And that's not really the reality of, great performers in these AI companies. And so actually you're starting to see a shift from effort into more impact and like leverage based compensation, and you're starting to see those two things split out a little bit. And so I do think, as talent leaders or recruiters, like how you think about the performance framework in an organization and how that relates to keeping great talent on board. How do you think about incentivizing great talent? How do you manage people out? Like fundamentally looks quite different at the moment.
Really interesting. I think, most organizations, particularly Fortune 500, have quite a large budget for AI transformation projects at the moment. I feel like when we moved to the cloud in, the early 2010s, like we did that digital transformation era, and now we're in the AI transformation era, and it's in every single element. I guess as you like are starting to position this, internally and externally, what kind of data did you get from the report, or what did you uncover?
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of really interesting things that have come out with it, like some organizations, almost half of their coding is now automated, right? There are some major AI companies that all of their SMB to mid-market sales are fully agent-based now, and they just sort of have human in the loops, right? You're now getting to situations where you have agents selling to agents, right? And so I think it's really changing a lot of how we work. But I think one of the big things that the data showed us, which I think is kind of important, is that headcount reduction and like mass headcount changes to like road mapping, right, around the hiring piece did not really change within organizations. I think where it did change was the type of roles that you were hiring. And so you were hiring for more strategic AI enabled leaders, right? And maybe less so around sort of the administrative side of things, but fundamentally, like headcount was still growing within these organizations. And so I think there's sometimes this sort of view of AI is taking these jobs. And I think what you're seeing is that like is creating new roles within teams and new opportunities to do more strategic, higher level work. And so the headcount planning for a lot of these companies have actually not reduced, right? Despite the efficiency, it's growing, but it's just growing in areas where you might not have thought it would have. And so that's across all functions, really.
Amazing. I think it is interesting. Like my nephew's 15 at school, just graduating, and he had a guest lecturer come in, and they said like most of the jobs you're going to be doing in 10 years, probably not even thought of yet, those job
Yeah.
titles and those remits, but what you thought you might do might not exist. So we are in a rapidly changing landscape. I guess I'm quite keen to dig into, just as a bit of a tangent, the new roles
Yeah.
and actually qualifying the candidates who can impact on AI, because it's quite easy to get through an interview these days with the knowledge available. I guess, have you kind of identified this as a potential area for weakness for clients, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, a C-level executive in a public company actually said to me last week that whenever he gets an inbound for someone looking for a role, the first thing he asks now, instead of saying like send me your CV or let's do a coffee, is like, show me something that you've built with AI in the last 2 weeks. And so that is a really good sort of just like pulse check around like, is this someone thinking about how you actually embed this technology, right? And how you use it to be more efficient and impactful. And I think that's the way that the world is moving. It's less around like, have you done what I'm looking for before, right? Whereas I think in traditional sort of environments, we were like, okay, has this person seen this scale before, or done this role before, and understands what they're doing? And now it's like, actually, how creatively can this person think? And oftentimes, what we're seeing, especially in our portfolio companies, are like, it's oftentimes people that have never actually done this before, right? But are actually looking at this from a completely new perspective around automation and tooling and how you get creative with some of these things. And so I think that's one of the big trends that we've seen is like we're hiring less for been there, done that, and we're taking a lot of risks on people that have a lot of, I think, headroom in many ways. And then I also would think that, what I'm seeing is we're seeing less functional alignment to a lot of the roles, and it's more about, okay, can this person, and you're seeing it with terms like go-to-market engineer, if you've heard of that, or like your legal engineer, your forward deployed engineer, right? Fundamentally, it's someone that can be on the front line selling, but also be quite technical and also speak to the product and do a product demo, right? And so you're almost hiring these people that can basically do everything full cycle versus having these silos of different teams of like, this is your salesperson, this is your product person, this is your tech person. You have this one person that is able to do it. And I think AI allows you to have that leverage and have those roles. And I think you're seeing that in all of these AI companies of these sort of field engineers, right? And fundamentally, they're leveraging these tools to be able to basically be on the front line, be technical, and speak to the product.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you feel from a talent perspective with these forward deployed engineers or, the AI engineer role, do you feel like there's enough talent in the market, or do you think companies are going to be fighting for these people who can actually do that role?
I mean, we're all fighting for it. I don't think there's nearly enough. It's very competitive right now for that type of role. And, I think it is fairly new, right? I think you could say go-to-market engineer back in traditional software was kind of like your solution architect, right? Back in the
Mm,
day. It's fundamentally kind of a 2.0 version of that. But it is a very different skill set. And so I think like when you think about all of these sort of entry level roles maybe getting consumed with some automation, right? Like where is the next wave of talent going to like learn, right? As entry level
yeah,
graduates, I do think it's more of those sort of holistic field roles like a go-to-market engineer as an example.
nice. Okay. Well, look, I'm wary of the agenda and the time we've got to get through, so I want to make sure we can cover everything off for you. So second topic for today's forum. So this is around how the report notes that AI changes pay, equity, and who gets rewards. Can you talk us
Yeah.
through this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very hot topic. I would say we spend probably a couple of hours a week with founders on this, and I don't think there's necessarily a right answer yet. And I think that's kind of true with everything right now. We're kind of experiencing this all together as it's happening, as probably one of the most interesting moments in technology right now. I would say, just generally speaking, like the cost of talent has changed, right? So early on, talent is kind of the fundamental cost to a company as they're scaling, and that's what you would expect to see. Now, with AI companies, you're seeing that different on the P&L. It's much more around like the infrastructure and the product because your headcount costs are lower, right? Because you don't need as many people necessarily, especially in the early days. And so I think what that means and what we're trying to sort of investigate further, but based on the data, is like you're kind of seeing, to my point earlier, you're splitting out this idea of like compensation related to leveling and role and more around impact. And so leaders in these companies need to get comfortable decoupling that, right? And really being able to be comfortable not having those sort of like very strict guidelines around like, okay, a VP gets paid this much and like a director gets paid this much. And it's much more around the impact that they have within an organization, which is really tough because it's a completely different comp philosophy, I would say. But, there are many AI organizations that you'll see that don't have, yes, they have structure internally, but externally, they don't have any titles, right? Your go-to-market or your engineering or your product, right? And it's really, really flat externally. And I think that is part of this idea of, you know, it's all about the impact and less about sort of the seniority and the hierarchy. And so you're naturally seeing some of these companies be leaner and flatter, and as a result, you have to think about what is fair compensation despite of that. And so we're starting to see those two things kind of be split out a little bit. Um, and what I would say is like a lot of leaders are I not necessarily kind of getting into some of these roles, at least what we're finding, if they're not AI fluent and curious about AI. And so a lot of times, throughout interview processes, it is about like, how do you use it? What have you built, right? What are some use cases and stories that you can speak to? And I think that's a really big thing, right? And so you could be a really seasoned experienced executive, C-level, big comp, all of the bells and whistles, right? But fundamentally, these AI companies want to see success there. And you could be hired as like the first sales IC, right? And be paid a lot of money, right? But with no title and no team. And some executives find that really hard, right? And it's a different shift in mentality in terms of like you're a C-level executive managing a large team versus being an IC. But still necessarily making the same money.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think I'm going to steal the phrase, the cost of talent has changed. I think that's probably a really good way to phrase things. And we're talking about what the impact of it is. You mentioned you spent a couple of hours with CEOs, majority gathering this information. I guess I'm interested to know like which companies are like ahead of the curve, and like is there any like certain sectors that are behind the curve, do you think?
Um, it's a good question. I probably can't speak to it necessarily. I think our compliance team will have a problem with that. But what I would say is that, you know, AI native companies are just moving at a much faster pace, right? Because they don't have some of the legacy, right? And sort of the frameworks that they were so used to before, versus traditional software, right? And so what we're seeing is that, like, in terms of competing for talent, winning the right talent, being able to retain them. Like those companies just have a leg up just by the nature of them being newer, more agile, and just native to the world that we're in. There was an amazing tweet actually from Intercom. You can find it around like the work that they have done internally to really transform themselves, and they've done an amazing job. But it's really hard for software companies because you're essentially choosing to break 90% of what you have, right? And reinvent yourself. And so that's really tough. I think it's very hard if you're a public company as well to do that, right? Because public markets are much more complicated. And so you have all of these complexities that kind of play into it. And so without being able to talk to detail around it, what I would just say is like obviously these AI native companies are able to kind of move forward at a faster rate with all of these types of.
I think it's crashed for me. Is it Miriam? Are you back with us?
I'm
Sorry,
back. Yes,
it
sorry.
buzzed out there. No, all good. Again, a bit of a tangent question as you kind of talking. I guess you talked about public companies there. Do you feel like with AI becoming more efficient and making business more profitable, would there always be that desire for companies to want to go down the IPO route, or do you feel like things might change in the future?
Um, I think there's less of a need or a pressure to go public. I think there are a lot of complexities to going public, and so it has to be the right thing for the company and for the team. I think what we're seeing is that a lot of companies are staying private for much longer. And I think we probably will see that. And so if that's the path that they continue on, I would assume that we'll see more M&A happening, right? Companies getting acquired to drive value and consolidation and liquidity, right? And so you probably will see that happening if companies choose to stay private for longer.
I think it'll be certainly interesting for sure. Can we just like touch base here and talk about the implication for talent leaders? Like we've
Yeah.
spoken about the kind of roles we're going to do, but for people here who's day to day speaking to candidates and essentially assessing are they AI native, what do you think it means for us?
I think fundamentally, like, we need to, as talent leaders, whether it's like operationally in-house or in recruitment or in funds, really be challenging founders, and also candidates to understand like how do they best position themselves either to acquire the best talent or for a candidate to end up in the right roles, right? And compete for the right roles. And I think fundamentally, like when you're speaking to candidates, to my point earlier, it really is like, how are you using these tools to create these stories of value, right? And it's much more around the storytelling and the articulation of how you're using AI to do things. Whether it's like you're building an app, right? Or you built a agent to automate like a workflow that you use every day and it saved you like 5 hours, right? Like I think that shows up far more significantly in an interview to a founder than, oh, I beat my quota as an AE, right? 5 years in a row, right? I think that that doesn't land in the same way as it necessarily did before. And so I think as recruiters, like you want to be asking those questions or like, how do you think about it? What are you seeing? How are you using it? Why aren't you using it in some cases, right? And I think like great talent in this day and age need to be showing it, right? And so there are some relationships that like I personally have with great leaders that are, of course stuck in their old ways and habits die hard, right? And you're kind of the voice of like I'm out in the market, I'm hearing what's happening and like I really think you need to be using this and changing the way you use it. And ultimately leadership roles set the tone for their teams, right? So if your leaders are not using it and promoting it and advocating and actually having KPIs that are attached to it, right? Fundamentally, you're not going to see that change within the organization. And so it starts from the top. And so, whether it's a C-level hire or an IC, like you want to see that flavor within the conversation around how they're automating as much as they can.
Completely agree. You talked about SMB mid-market reps being replaced with agents from a selling capacity. Do you think that ever changes completely for enterprise sellers for these big solutions?
I don't think so. And like I still think at like SMB or definitely mid-market, like you'll still have a human in the loop. But I think at enterprise, like fundamentally it's so relationship based. And the signals that you get human to human, like AI cannot ultimately generate that or analyze it. And when you think about, an 18, 24-month sales cycle at an enterprise level and all the various stakeholders there, like that is a human interaction, right? And so again, whilst much of that can be automated and it can make that seller show up better, right? And more articulate and more educated because an agent can give them a summary right before every meeting, right? Or prompt them to ask certain questions. I don't think it will ever be kind of replaced. And again, it should potentially allow those SMB sales leaders or mid-market leaders to move up to enterprise if they wanted to, right? And they may not want to. It's a very different motion for sure. But again, like it allows people to do different strategic, higher impact work should they want to do it. Now, if they don't want to do it, I think there will still always be a human in the loop, right? Fundamentally. And so again, going back to like you'll have the disparity between like the super high performers and not like I think the performance framework still has to nurture the people that maybe are using it less but are still value add, right? Because there is still a world for those individuals within an organization. And so we have to be conscious of that as well.
I think that's almost quite reassuring to hear, to be honest, that there'll always be the human element within AI. I think there are fears that eventually we'll just live in an AI world completely. So it's kind of good to know. Right, let's kind of dig into our final area for today's forum. So this is around incentives, now shaping AI adoption, not just rewards. Can you help us understand this a bit more?
Yeah, so we're not seeing, I would say we're at the beginning of seeing this, right? I don't think it as is as widespread, but I think it will, right? So for example, when some of our companies hire, or even outside of our portfolio, some of them say you cannot use AI, right? Others say we expect you to use AI, right? And so people are approaching this very differently at the moment. I do think that over time, it will just be so commoditized that you expect people are using it, in the same way that we don't say you can't use the internet, right? When you're maybe pulling a case study together. Like it is kind of a given that you are meant to use the tools that are there to do the best that you can, right? And so that is in terms of hiring, we're seeing like a real shift there. But I think it then translates like in terms of compensation and particularly bonuses, right? Like, how are you thinking about tying usage or efficiency or impact to compensation and KPIs, right? And so KPIs now are becoming less input based and more output based. And it's more around, you know, what have you been able to, you know, deliver, right, in a certain amount of time? How many hires have you closed in and what length of time, right? Versus how many hires have you made, right? It's more about the speed and the efficiency as KPIs. And that's been a real change. I would also say that, you know, we're seeing companies do, you know, internal hackathons where they shut down the company and everyone is meant to build and experiment. You know, some of our companies every 2 weeks have demo days where someone is on the hook for showcasing to the company their new product, right? Their new feature that they want to roll out and show it to the entire organization. And so you're seeing this as a culture within organizations, you know, holding everyone to account around like using it, building it, becoming more efficient, and then showcasing it internally, but also attaching some of your compensation or your performance metrics and your KPIs to those types of engagements. And so that's like a real shift that we've seen, right? And I think in the world of like, this is your OTE and your comp is X% and you just have to hit your quota, right? I think those worlds are kind of changing slightly, right? And I think it will be interesting to see how it evolves. But like compensation is a topic that I think, you know, every 3 to 6 months probably needs to get revisited because it's changing so quickly, especially if you're trying to compete for the best talent. And so, you know, we look at compensation data quite significantly at Iconic. And whilst we did, you know, annual refreshes, we're finding those refreshes need to happen a lot quicker because of just the pace of how everything is kind of moving at the moment.
Mm. I completely agree. Obviously, we're in the trenches on in the industry with yourself, and you know there's great talent out there who are taking counter offers, huge six-figure retention bonuses because companies know that level of impact they have. I guess you know that's from our side, but from your side, like what exactly have you seen to demonstrate this?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I guess like I'm just looking to see what you know what have you seen that demonstrates this from your side around um what good performance looks like, the change of OTEs, the consistent benchmarking of salary data.
Yeah. So I think I think, I mean, the one thing to say is like if someone's at an amazing AI company, like people are walking away from a lot of unvested equity because like they can get it somewhere else. And so it's almost like not, you know, retaining talent in the same way as maybe you people would hope it would, right? Because it is just so competitive out there. But like, you know, in terms of the equity piece, we're seeing crazy things like, you know, immediate vesting and no cliff and, you know, annual refreshes, like very, very significant changes to what it was before, which was like 4 years and cliffs and, you know, refreshes after a certain period. Like everything is almost like day one, day zero, essentially.
Mm,
And then I would also say that, you know, some companies are tracking the usage of AI and the time that is being saved, right? Or the incremental impact an individual can make as a KPI. And that is the driving force behind, is this an overachiever? Is this someone that is going to get promoted, right? And it's more based on that versus sort of maybe some of your more traditional frameworks of, okay, someone needs to be in a role for X number of years before they are able to get to this next sort of phase, right, in their career and their path. And it's more about, okay, have they hit some of these milestones that we kind of would expect in terms of high performance environments?
got it. Got it. Well, look, last two questions from me. I guess is there anything in the report that you kind of wanted to tell people about today that we've not covered?
Um, I think, you know, it's important to sort of say that like everyone has these sort of concerns or anxieties when it comes to using AI, what it means more broadly, you know, all of these sort of anxieties and nervousness around it. And I don't think that any of that has gone away. I think it's all still very real in many ways. But I think what we have seen now more recently is that, you know, it is being managed very intentionally throughout organizations. And so what you're seeing is, adoption in organizations go up, not because people are less nervous about it, right? But because they're getting better education or better training on it. They're being incentivized to use it. And I think we start to see these shifts within organizations when it starts at the top, right? And we help individuals on a one-to-one consumer level basis, right? Think about how AI can really help them and strategically move their career and their personal life forward, right? Like we all kind of win when we use it, right? And so I think this shift that we're seeing in terms of uptake within AI adoption is not because people are just, not worried about it, right? I think it's just more companies are really being, intentional if they're doing it correctly about taking individuals through that journey and doing it properly, and doing it efficiently, right? I don't think we can do it slowly, but like even speaking about Iconic ourselves, like, we have leaderboards, we talk about it every week, we do get demos on a weekly basis, everyone is, responsible for building their own agents to use as a team, right, based on their own individual workflows. And so instead of it being like, okay, this might be like a product team's problem or like an IT team's problem or not mine, right? It fundamentally becomes it's your own problem to try and figure out. And I think that kind of instills this culture of, this is the way forward. And so I think that's something that the report really sort of showcased as well, that, people are still nervous about it and have a lot of questions, and we still don't know all these answers. But I think great organizations are kind of starting from the top, and these leaders are instilling it as like, this is everyone's responsibility, and we're going to help enable you to use it.
Amazing. Really interesting to hear. Well, look, my last question for the day from you before I open up any Q&A, I guess like I really feel like we talked about the future impact and what feels like a shorter term impact. Is there anything in the report where you think like long term we can see some really big changes or big changes in AI completely?
So we've consciously tried to stay away from like long-term impact suggestions because I just think it's changing so quickly. And so everything as it relates to how we're thinking about AI adoption, talent, we're kind of thinking it in like 12 months increments because it is just changing so significantly. And so like the short answer is like no, I don't think anyone can kind of think about the long term. I think like the short term holds so many changes in itself that it'll be really interesting to see sort of where we are this time next year. But I do think like, you know, if you think about leadership hiring, I think one of the big changes will be, you'll have very senior ICs within organizations or very lean teams, right? And so maybe gone are the days where you have 2,000 people on your team, right? And that was maybe a sign of seniority and experience and credibility. I don't think that is the way that it will go. It might, right? But I think you'll see, very senior individuals, teams, very credible teams have very lean, efficient types of organizations.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. No one knows the future with how things are changing. Well, look, thank you so much for answering my questions and talking through the report. We really appreciate it. I'll open up the floor in case anyone's got some last Q&A questions. Otherwise, Helen and I will probably get together and produce like a little one pager and take key takeaways from today that we can share with our audience and the wider group who couldn't make it. But yeah, any guests would like to ask a question?
I will, John, if you don't mind. It was relating to what you said, Mariam, about I guess having a human in the loop with SMB and mid-market, but that it'll always be there hands-on in enterprise. Do you expect that gulf will widen? And then I guess, if someone's mid-market now, maybe looking to make the leap into enterprise and, discussing a role with ourselves, how do we like reassure them that that pathway is still going to be viable?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's definitely viable, right? And I think, even if they are going to be the human in the loop for mid-market, like there is still an amazing career to be had there and money to be had there, right? I think like AI is only just increasing, spend in technology in the impact technology can make. I think like, the ecosystem and the pie is just getting bigger and bigger, right? So I think regardless of where that person wants to take their career, there is still an opportunity and impact. Um, I think fundamentally, like if you are an organization that is selling to SMB and enterprise, like the strategic deals are your enterprise deals, right? Those are the ones that, you might lose sleep over, right? And so to allow individuals the opportunity to maybe move up into that if they wanted to, like I think that is, and it should be exciting for them, right? Because these tools kind of help enable you to be able to do that.
Nice. That's good to know. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, look, it was great to have you today as a guest. Thank you so much for your time and knowledge on the report. Really appreciate it. And I'll wrap up nicely there on time.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks for your
Take
time,
care,
All right.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.